Oh, it's an hour, yeah. And then we have time for questions.
Okay. Let's start, please. So, I would like to start with just a brief introduction of what we're going to hear and attend with the kind support of Camilla. Mindfulness means maintaining a moment-by-moment awareness of our thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, and surrounding environment through a gentle, nurturing lens. Mindfulness also involves acceptance, meaning that we pay attention to our thoughts and feelings without judging them, without believing, for instance, that there is a right or wrong way to think or feel in a given moment. When we practice mindfulness, our thoughts tune into what we are sensing in the present moment, rather than rehashing the past or imagining the future. Camilla Ghazala began her daily mindfulness practice and journey in 1983, and teaching this technique to others in 2000. Her teachers are the Buddhist Sangha at Amaravati Buddhist Monastery in UK, the oldest UK Buddhist monastery. As an experienced therapist, coach, supervisor and tutor, Adlerian psychology is Camilla's core theoretical philosophy, which is integrated when appropriate with CBT, Gestalt, Buddhist psychotherapy, transitional analysis, systemic coaching, compassionate therapy, energy psychology, mindfulness of course, nutrition, shamanic psychology, walking and development, animal assistant therapy, sewing and development. Camilla's passion is enabling development of personal awareness, stability, self-management, assertiveness and resilience using safe, effective, therapeutic and educational interventions. Camilla is one of the best representatives of mindfulness as a highly skilled assessor, identifier, formulator and therapist of a wide range of psychological, emotional and behavioral issues. Working for short, medium and long therapeutic treatments with mild to severe long-term presentations. Using the previously mentioned types of therapy, Camilla has many thousands of hours of clinical, coaching, CPD and teaching experience. Taking the baton from Dr. Fiorentina Stekach, who has been leading with great success the Suffolk Psychology Society for over 4 years, for the above and many other reasons, we are really happy to host tonight, at the first talk of the Suffolk Psychology Society for 2019-20 academic year, the psychotherapist Camilla Ghazala.
Thank you very much, Manos. What that really adds up to is that I'm just really old. And I've been around quite a long time, which is, would be the nutshell of all of that information. So thank you so much for coming this evening. It's nice to see some familiar faces and also to see some new faces. I'm going to share some information with you which will take about an hour, and then we've put in quite a nice bit of time for discussion, although within what I'm going to share with you, we're going to do a bit of discussion work as well. This lecture is usually 3 or 4 hours long, so in order for us to leave before midnight, I'm going to stick really closely to my PowerPoints, otherwise I get overexcited, we'll be here all night and you'll be asleep. So, I think I'm supposed to say a bit of health and safety stuff. I'm not very good at all of that. If the alarm goes, I'll be first out the door, follow me. Okay. So I think that's the health and safety stuff bit covered. So that's me. Manos has already covered more than covered all of that. I do a range of stuff. I'm just interested in working in a way that clients can have easiest access to. So my interest is connecting with people and looking at what we can do realistically to enable them to generally lower symptoms and find ways of managing life that allow things to be a little smoother, really. So one of the things I do a bit of work on is I do some animal-assisted therapy. Good evening. Good evening. And this is Barney, who helps me. I love my dog. Who helps me do a bit of animal-assisted therapy. I don't use Barney all the time, but he is particularly good at working with clients who present with severe and long-term enduring depression or some of the personality disorder issues that I work with. The mindfulness bit of my jigsaw, Manus has mentioned already, so I've been going to Amravati for a long time. I could talk all night about Amravati, but this is one of my teachers, Sister Brahmarava, so they're amazing. I'm taught by the Sangha, anyone can go there, you don't have to be into anything to go there. Their generosity in their information and teaching never ceases to amaze me, so I always find it a privilege to be there. I've just come back actually. I try and get there twice a year. It doesn't always work, but generally twice a year. Very briefly, what are we doing tonight? I want to look at what mindfulness is and what it isn't. We can spend a long time on that as well. Identify the benefits. Not going to spend very long on that because there is so much massive research now, but if you're into research, which you probably are because you're here, you can pick up what I've touched on tonight and do much more on that. I want to talk about how it supports our mental health, and then also to signpost if you want to learn how to practice mindfulness or you want to freshen up your practice, how you might do that. Let's go through what it isn't. I have very mixed feelings about this. Mindfulness has become a really common talked about thing in our culture. I think like anything that becomes very commonly talked about, that brings lots of really useful stuff to the party and some really unuseful stuff to the party. So a brief check-in about what I believe it isn't. Okay, it's not a belief system. To practice this technique, you don't need to have any belief system at all, because it is a technique. It's not, unfortunately, a practice that happens by itself, in the same way that if we want to join a gym and improve our physical fitness, we do actually have to go. I've been trying to get around that one my whole life, but haven't quite managed that yet, but I'll let you know if I do. A lot of people talk about mindfulness as a form of meditation, and a lot of people talk about meditation and that it is stopping our mind from thinking. Absolutely not. That is not what meditation is at all. Positive thinking, while there's some useful aspects in some of that, although therapeutically we're moving on from labelling thinking as positive or negative, there's lots of reasons for that. Might come back to that. It's not that. It's definitely not fighting with our thoughts, which creates, generally, if that's what's going on, that will continue whatever symptoms are going on that people are trying to de-escalate. So it's not doing that. As much as we'd like it to be, it's not doing that either. So, and a lot of these things are, if we go into something with these expectations or wishes, we're already putting a strain into whatever we're going into. A bit like if I join the gym because I want to become an amazing marathon runner, clearly it's not going to happen. I would already be putting a strain into my exercise routine, which actually will put strain on my body, which actually means I won't get as much out of my exercise routine as I perhaps would have done, and I'm just setting myself up for less than perhaps I could gain. Meditation, although many people would say it's emptying the mind, it's nothing to do with emptying the mind. We will never empty our mind because it's our mind's job to think. And that's really handy in lots of ways. Not good, it's fine. Good evening. It's not going into a trance, that's something else. And it's not the same as being mindful. So being mindful is a bit like, if I stay with that gym metaphor, being mindful is a bit like turning up at the gym. Mindfulness practice is doing the exercise. There's actually quite a clear distinction between those two positions, although they have some links. And it's not for those currently in deep crisis, we could talk about that all night as well. The reality is, if anybody is currently in a deep crisis, this is not the time to try and learn anything. Because if we're in deep crisis, we are already completely fragmented. We have no connection between our head brain and our heart brain and our gut brain. There is no connection between these three at all. People are fragmented and in pieces, which is why our language supports that. We say we're in bits, or we're blown apart, or we're in bits all over the floor. When we're in that place, we have no access to take on board information and to embed it and do something with it. We need a different form of support. It might be when the crisis is over and people have begun to be stuck back together, if you like. This might be a useful time to look at mindfulness, because we'd also want to look at what caused the deep crisis in the first place, but we can spend a night on that as well. So those are the few of the things that I think it's not. Trudy Eddington gave me permission to use these pictures, who did a talk here a few years ago actually. What it is the word is everywhere, and as I've touched on, I think this brings some useful things to the party, and also some not so useful things. So what do I think it is? I think it's a technique, it's an exercise, it is a practice. It's a type of meditation. There are many forms of different styles of meditation. Mindfulness is one of them. And what it does is it develops our skill of observation. The way that I see observation is that we all have the skill of observing. I think it's a bit like a muscle in the mind, and what mindfulness does is it strengthens our observer muscle. We all have that already. That's an innate part of being a human being. It also, there's another element to it, and if here we are observing, and we'll come back to that, the other bit of mindfulness is actually the attitude that we're observing ourselves with, which is phenomenally a powerful thought process. We'll come back to that. There is a philosophy that runs parallel, and that is purely optional. As I dropped in before, people need no belief system of any description to practice mindfulness. It's an exercise. However, there's lots of philosophy that runs alongside, and people are interested in that. What I say to a lot of my clients is that, again, we can read about going to the gym an awful lot and still say sitting in our sofa at home, which means we've acted on nothing. Much better people start to practice mindfulness, and if they want to get into the philosophy down the road, brilliant. But actually getting into the philosophy sometimes can become an avoidance of actually doing the practice. And yeah, that's an interesting one. So what is meditation? Well, Thich Nhat Hanh, who runs an amazing place in the north of France, talks about this. It's not an escape from life. And I think I like the beginning of that quote. Because of lots of historical information, meditation in some areas of our culture has been given the view that it is actually an escape from life. So you can just go up and sit in a mountain and meditate and everything is fine. This is not meditation. It's not an escape from life, it's ongoing preparation for really being in life, or an ongoing support system, I would say, for really being in life. Manos mentioned this earlier. It enables engagement in the here and now. A lot of people talk about embracing everything. I think that is an overused word. We are human beings. None of us feel like embracing everything all the time. I think we would have to be a robot to feel like that all the time. What it does is it enables us to connect to and hang out in the here and now a bit more. Really useful for our mind to keep focused and on track sometimes. It enables them access to a wider reality. What we're going to go on to look at is some of the thought habits that create a lot of very common symptoms in our culture that are labelled as mental health issues. One of the things that meditation does, or flexing that observer muscle that we have, is it enables us to zoom in and look at information when that's really useful and look at detailed information and not get stuck in that position. We can also zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And I think it's a really useful adult habit to be able to have access to that zoom ability of our mind. A lot of the symptoms, again, that are labelled as mental health issues are where our zoom lens has become stuck. We're either stuck on too much detail or we're stuck on the overview picture, and actually we need to be able to move between both of those as appropriate. I've just been talking about that really. We can recalibrate and develop the culture of our mind. So one of the things that, I don't think this just comes from mindfulness, is that thoughts are just thoughts. And this goes back to what I said about the aim of meditation, and we're talking about mindfulness tonight, is not to attempt to empty the mind. If we are trying to do that, then we're setting ourselves up into a battle position. That's just going to create a massive amount of anxiety and probably eventually depression in the body. That one of the things that we drop into it is that thoughts are just thoughts. They're just information. And emotions that follow thoughts are information. So there's a big shift in the psychotherapy culture in that, I would say thankfully, we're moving away from the culture of labelling thoughts as negative or positive and labelling emotions as negative or positive. These are really undevelopmental things to do, because all the time we are labelling a constant stream of thoughts or a constant movement of emotions as good or bad. Actually, we set up another level of anxiety in the body. Thoughts are just thoughts and emotions are just emotions. They're information. If we come from that place, we are much freer to actually look at the consequence of what's going on with us, rather than getting into some sort of power battle of, well, I should be thinking this and I shouldn't be thinking this, and this just keeps people in another level of anxiety. I don't know about you, but this sort of looks like my everyday life most of the time, in terms of there is a permanent, consistent flow of tasks. I feel most of the time I'm bombarded with information. I go to the supermarket to buy a toothpaste, and there is, I don't know, how many different types of toothpaste on the shelf. I find myself, it's almost a consistent part of my day now where I'm prioritising and repositioning tasks. Generally, I feel like I'm working with other people's chaos and things that constantly change. What I am attempting to do most of the time is manage that culture and remain in some sort of grounded, assertive, empathic position. I say most of the time because I'm a human being and no one's in a static position all the time. That's not what we're trying to get into. So your life may not look like this, but mine certainly does, and a lot of people that I work with, their lives look something like that as well. We could have another whole lecture on how culturally we've ended up here, but we might say that for another time. John Kabat-Zinn, another fantastic mindfulness teacher who's written some really good books. One of them actually has a CD in the back of it, which is a really practical thing to get if you want to practice a bit of mindfulness. Manos mentioned this earlier, paying attention on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And I want to talk about that non-judgmentally thing. There's a really clever thing on here, look at that. Oh, that's so exciting. We're going to talk about that non-judgmentally bit as well. I'm going to rattle through the brief science bit because there's masses of information out there, and again, we could spend a whole day on this. And what we have actually is some fantastic information. Not all of that comes out of the Buddhist quarters, but there's been a lot of research for the last 50, 60 years working with people who have meditated as part of their life. Not all Buddhists meditate, but that would generally mean that we've got information from those quarters, and there's some really interesting research on that. So it does all these things. It increases our cortisol thickness, it increases our hippocampus and grey matter, it increases our brain connectivity. That's a really funky thing for us to actually be working on. Decreases activation of amygdala. I can't even say that. I'm going to put that in my really simple language. It actually, if you look at the vagus nerve and the nervous system, what it enables us to do is hang out most of the time, where our vagus nerve is at a mid-range stimulation level. What we don't want to be doing is hanging out with an overstimulated nervous system or vagus nerve, because that just means that we're use that word stress. That could be another whole conversation, really. The word stress is the beginning of a dialogue, not the end of one. Stress is an umbrella term, and if people unpacked it and actually looked at what was going on, they would have far more ability to do something about their nervous system levels. Lots of information about depression and inflamed minds and inflamed guts, and lots of information out there about the 3 brain centers that we have. We have a brain in our heads, really handy for lots of reasons. We have a brain in our heart, really handy for lots of reasons, and we have a brain. When I say a brain, I mean a set of neurons, and they work in the same form, but they have a different culture. We have one in our head, one in our heart, and one in our gut. There's lots of really interesting research in terms of acute depression and other very acute mental health positions that now link those positions to inflammation in the mind and inflammation in the gut. Meditation brings that inflammation down, which is also really handy. That's really handy if we want to develop new cellular structure in our brain. My parents came from a generation where they were, I can hear, my dad would say this now, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And you can't learn anything, and you can't change a leopard's spots, as it were. And that's very much, I'm generalising, how my parents' generation was raised. We have more information than this now. We actually know that it is possible to develop new cellular structures of the mind, and do lots of other funky things with our mind. Another brief science bit, we're going to move on from this. A lot of things that are labelled as mental health come down to an over or an under processing habit. We'll come back to that. Addiction cycles lead on from extreme over or under processing in one mind or another, in some way or another. I tried to come up with a nutshell because that's all far too complicated for my brain. All in all, a nutshell means that actually what we develop is our neuroplasticity in our mind. And this, to me, is a bit more in English, really. So what does that mean? That means that our attention span can improve. That means we can carry on learning and recalling information. It is, I'm not saying that everything is black and white. What I am saying is that in the same way that physical exercise may de-escalate issues later in our life, or give us the possibility of maintaining a physical structure that is supportive for our lives, mindfulness is the same for our head structure. That doesn't mean we can stop everything happening that we don't want to happen, and it doesn't mean there are magic wands in life. Neuroplasticity, emotional regulation. An essential part of us being able to regulate our emotions is how our head works, because these two need to work in tandem as well as the heart-mind. Mental agility and adaptation, that means to me that's that ability to zoom in and out of information as appropriate and decide what positioning is most useful for us. Empathic attitude towards self and others. Any idea why that might be quite a useful thing? Any thoughts about that? I'm like really bored of my voice now because I've been talking for 20 minutes, so I need to stop. Any thoughts about why that might be useful or not useful?
Be nice to people.
Yeah, which sounds nice, but is it?
Negative emotions aren't good for us, really. A negative emotion is not good if we're carrying that negativity and we're angry and we're not showing anything.
We might go on a different page about how we might label that, because the psychology that I come from, we wouldn't see anger as a negative emotion. What people might do with it may have consequences that we may not like, or we might like, but I just wanted to put that there into our pot. But there's something really important about what you're saying. What do we get out of people if we offer them our anger?
Sorry, I was just going to say that by recognising your own thoughts and feelings, it makes you a bit more in tune to other people's.
Yeah.
So then it's sort of a sense of connectedness between those sort of social beings.
Yeah.
I think it means sort of basically, you can sort of help each other sort of be happier or share sad times. We have to be happy all the time, just sort of conversation, really.
Yeah, there's lots of elements in what you're saying which would link to what you were saying in terms of we are social beings, and again using that mental health umbrella, that term, if there are significant mental health issues, one of the bits of the jigsaw, and there's never one bit of the jigsaw, is that there is somewhere some challenging in terms of having social connectedness to the self and to the others. So this is a key part of our well-being position, if you like.
Is it like a tuning?
Yeah, that as well, and being kind. It's all of those things, but the reality is, if we want to encourage ourselves to develop and to manage everyday life, then this gives us a different fuel to running off anxiety, and we're going to go on with other things. It gives us different juice to run off. It also encourages other people to develop and run off perhaps different juice. Recover from challenges. We will all have challenges in life. We cannot avoid hideous stuff happening, and this is part of the deal. This is part of being a human being. How we deal with the hideous stuff is actually what we really ought to be looking at. The hideous stuff needs to do something with it, but actually really what I'm interested in is how people deal with it. How they deal with it, how they work with their recovery, and what we need to put in place to support that. Resilience, we touched on that. New style of thinking, we touched on that. So this is from Trudy Eddington, and I really love this picture of the brain. So to recap on that, our brain is just an extraordinary organ. Is too simple a word to say that, but we have the ability to develop new neurons. We have our ability to develop new things with those. You probably know this already, but these are the pathways through which our thoughts travel, if you like. And we can create a huge range of different cultured neurons in our mind. And we will all have a huge range of different cultured neurons in our mind. We talked about that a bit, I think. We know a lot in our culture. Actually, this is part of Manos's speciality. So we know in our culture that taking care of our physical bodies is helpful, might help prevent stuff, it might not, but that is a bit of our responsibility, isn't it? That's the bit that we can do something about. We know the proactive actions that come from, in terms of taking care of our physical health, exercise, eating, drinking, most of the time in support of our mind and body. I am clearly not a purist. I worry about purist programs because I think they almost create an extreme psychology to follow them, so I don't think that that's healthy at all. I think if we can, most of the time, do something. I think that that's a far more realistic and a far more encouraging psychological attitude to come from. We are human beings, we are not robots. And yeah, it's about finding some middle ground. That's one of the things that I've learned a lot from the Buddhist teachers that I've had. A lot of our work, I think, is about finding a middle ground position for ourselves. Regular practice of mindfulness is caring for our psychological and emotional health, those 3 heart centres that I mentioned. Other proactive actions include deciding what style of information we feed our minds. Any thoughts about what I might mean by that?
I think spending far too much time listening to the news about Brexit. I watched the whole of the Supreme Court finding. I listened to the whole of Boris Johnson's response to it and the other MPs, and I'm thinking, why am I doing this? This is not good for me.
Okay. Yeah. There's no judgment about what people are into or what they're listening to, but I do think we need to make discerning decisions about what we are putting into our heads, as much as we need to make discerning decisions about what we're putting into our mouth, because both have a major impact on our all-round well-being. So you have to work out your own way of doing that. Personally, I don't watch the news anymore. I listen to the news on the radio because I don't want the visual images in my head. I have a pretty good in-touchness of what's going on in our world. And that came out of about a year of me going to bed every night in tears. And my husband said, "This is ridiculous. Why are you crying?" "Oh, I'm crying because of this, and this, and this." And I had got so lost into the culture that that's what I was supposed to do, was watch the news and be informed and be interested and think about what I'm doing about it. I chose to create a lot of distress in my life. So I've changed that. I changed that habit. Doesn't mean I don't know what's going on. But I do think we are raised more and more to be careful of what we put into our mouths. We are not yet raised enough to be careful of what we're putting into our mind. And I'm not going to get on my whole thing about blue screens and social media and all of that stuff, but the majority of the young people I work with who are really quite acutely unwell, this is one of the things we have to look at in a really serious way. I want to know what they're eating, and I want to know what they're mentally ingesting as well, because that's why they're unwell. You put those two together, you get a really unwell person who's really distressed and cannot function, some of them. We talked about that. Bit of a shame. I was brought up with Disney, think it's rubbish that there aren't magic wands or ones that, can change our lives or give us whatever we want. However, that is sort of the truth. So moving on to mindfulness a bit more, the way that I teach this to my clients is that we have 2 mind positions, and I'm talking particularly about this brain centre here, and both are really, really useful. I'm going to use the metaphor of fish as well, so I hope no one's like fish phobic, because you're going to get really sick of fish, because I've got those pictures of fish. I also know that I teach quite a lot in metaphor, and that works for some people and doesn't work so well for others, so I hope that the notes back up, and I'm really happy if anyone wants a copy of some of the PowerPoint stuff. I'm really happy to share that with you after. I'll talk to Manos about that. So 2 mind positions. We talked about the practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness is a technique, and the reason that we might do that technique is that it develops our observer muscle in our minds. And the reason I might do exercise techniques is because it develops other muscles in my body. Really similar process. The first mind position we have is when we are fully engaged in our thinking. These fish, by the way, are thoughts. So there we have our head with loads of fish swimming around in it, really busy, doing their thing. the first mind position we have is when we're fully engaged in thinking. This is really, really useful. If I want to write my list for Tesco's, or I want to remember that I haven't sent my sister a birthday card, it's really handy that I'm engaged in my thinking and writing a list of what to do. Brilliant. Our minds are brilliant. So when we're fully engaged, what are we doing? We're feeding lots of energy through those electrical impulses in our head, through those neurons. Energizing and encouraging our thoughts, strengthening those neuron networks, and actually creating new ones if we get onto creative thinking. So this is a very, very useful position. The other position that is feasible for us is to observe our thoughts. So our thoughts will still be swimming around like this, but we're observing them rather than being completely in them and feeling them. And that goes back to, if we develop both of those positions, then what we're developing is the skill to zoom in and look at detail, zoom out and look at the bigger picture, and move our brain position as is useful really, or as is appropriate. So this is my fish bowl, still on my fish fatigue. And I want to show what I mean by this. So if this is a head full of loads of thoughts, we'll come back to the style of thoughts. Being engaged in them means that we are absolutely fully engaged in our thinking. Really useful. But there's not really much separation between where we are and our thoughts. We are right in the process. Practicing mindfulness means that our fish are still swimming around, our thoughts are still busy, but part of us, we could have another whole lecture on which part of us, but part of us is actually external and observing our thoughts. That hasn't come out very clearly actually. That is loads of fish. What I was hoping to show by that image was that practicing mindfulness means that part of us is looking at all these thoughts rather than being in them. What we really need is to be able to do both. I've touched on that already. Any thoughts about why this is useful? Let me say that more clearly. Any thoughts about if we spend our lives just fully engaged in our thinking, how might that go for us, do you think?
You're using a lot of energy, aren't you, if you're just in it all the time?
Yeah.
And you can't actually, I don't think you can actually see clearly.
Yeah.
Because you're involved in it directly, whereas if you stand back a little bit, you can sort of get ideas more panoramic view.
Yes. Yeah. So you said a couple of things. I'm going to say. So one of the things you said was energy. We might be using quite a lot of energy. If we're fully engaged in where our thoughts are, we may be using a lot of energy. And the other thing you were saying is it's we can't stand back and look at.
No, you can't really see what's going on. You can get that panoramic view.
Yeah. So may not be so clear. May not be so. Our position may not be so clear. Okay. Any other thoughts about how our health might be affected if we?
If you can't stand back and observe what you're thinking, you won't have the ability to change the behaviour that you're drawn into. Whereas if you can step back and analyse what you're thinking, you then have the power to change the behaviour. That's how I feel.
Yeah. Yeah. Or keep with the behaviour because you like the consequences of it. And I'm glad you said that because I think that very often we talk about these things in terms of personal development because that's what we're talking about, and we talk about personal development because we think we should be changing everything. It's as important to look at what works well and do a bit more of that. I think one of the cultural challenges we have is we've become so trained to focus on what isn't going well and what isn't working okay and what we'd like to change. Our neurological position has been built into a slanted position. So a lot of the work I do with families and with people is actually enabling them, and this is again what creates a lot of mental health issues. A lot of the work that I do is enabling people to gain a wider perspective in terms of there must be loads of stuff that really is going well in life, and works really well for you, or you wouldn't be sitting in this room. So there has to be masses of stuff that's going really well. We need to be able to identify that and look at that as much as, if not a bit more, actually, than what isn't going so well and what isn't working so smoothly. If we can do both, we can link the two together. That's predominantly, they're probably the three most used diagnoses in our culture now. So all of them in some way, and it's not this black and white, but all of them in some way linked to having to have a stuck position, and either a stuck position either in over-processing or a stuck position outside of processing, so under, somewhere about that. Something about that. You'll know all of these. There's lots of mental health diagnoses. Personally, I'm not sure about the label mental health. It's probably another whole conversation. However, these are really, really commonly used diagnoses in our culture. I want to flip through really quickly some of the thinking styles that create those mental health issues. I also want to say, when anyone's doing any form of talk or giving information, you have to almost put the information in slight black and white form to share it. And health is never black and white, and people aren't black and white, they're holistic. And in terms of working with anybody and treating anybody, you need to have a very good understanding of their holistic presentation. The other thing I'll say is, while these thoughts absolutely will create extreme anxiety and distress in the body of one form or other, it's not all about saying, oh, well, it's just the way that I think then. Because if it was that simple, then we would just change the way that we thought and everyone would be fine. It's very feasible, and a lot of the clients I work with have, for whatever reason, come to be so habitually flooded with adrenaline, for whatever reason, that actually, as their vagus nerve drops into that middle ground place, the body will send out an alarm system that actually the body isn't in an adrenaline fuel place, so the body will then activate something. But it will always come through the mind one way or the other. What I'm trying to explain is that we are holistic, we are 360-degree holograms, so it is not as black and white as saying, well, then everything starts in the mind. No, it might start in this mind or this mind. We have to understand the whole relationship between these three and what's going on. However, I can guarantee that if we do this habit in an extreme way, we will be hugely anxious. So worry, rumination, that's looking backwards, that's time traveling. So worry is time traveling to the future. Planning about the future is really useful if we use the reflective process rather than the worry process. So the worry process from a neurological point of view often is a circular process, but it'll then drop into a cascading process. So I might be worrying about this subject and I'll go round and round, and then I'll just cascade into another subject and I'll go round and round, and then so this is the neurological pattern that's set up. Worry is always about future time travel. Rumination is about past time travel. I'm not talking about when we have a broken heart and need to do some healing around something that's happened. That might involve some really useful reflective practices. That's very different to rumination. Again, rumination has a circular and a cascading neurological position to it. And this will guarantee, if we do this a lot, then we'll guarantee that we have low mood, and we can guarantee eventually we'll become really severely depressed. Again, I want to be really clear. Depression is a hideous, hideous place to be, and acute depression is a really hideous place to be. So none of this is about that these things are simple and can be changed like that, but it does look at some of the holistic bits of the jigsaw that make up these hideous positions that people experience Black and white thinking, this is when the brain has become quite static and stuck in thinking, and you know, some things are black and white in life. If I carry on eating the amount of chocolate that I eat, then I will put on weight. That's pretty black and white. And if I spend too much money on books, then I will become overdrawn. That's pretty black and white. But in terms of humans and how we get on with humans and how we relate and all of that stuff we've touched on, none of this is black and white at all. It's multicoloured. And one of the things I like about the Buddhist psychology stuff is that we look at how we develop that multicoloured middle ground place. So we're not stuck in the extremes. Again, if you look at extreme mental health issues, personality disorders, people's psychology is stuck in an extreme position, or they go from one extreme to the other and don't know what this looks like. Hot thoughts, we do too many of those, we become really angry. It is really usual to label anger as a negative emotion, and I completely see why people do that. It actually depends on what we do with the energy, really. The behaviour that comes from the emotions are information, that's all they are. Powerful, and they're information. It's what we do with them, and the consequences of that, which we need to observe. We touched on that. Trapped thinking, or going back to what this lady said in the front, if we are stuck in this mind position, then it might be really difficult to step back and look at a wider view. Excessive processing we talked about. We talked about zooming in and out. That is obviously Nemo. I can't remember her name. Dory, obviously. Because I just think that film was a really good, a good visual image of dealing with really hideous stuff in life, and with social connection, with a friend, finding some way of getting through it, around it, and over it, and under it. Creative thinking. Creative thinking is when we have got our minds into the position where we are creating new neurons, whatever that might mean. That goes back to Tupman's work on group process and group dynamic. There's a free flow of momentum that we get sometimes. Sometimes people call it like being in the zone. It's when we're actually making new neurons. We touched on this earlier. Energizing thoughts. But what I don't want to do is give the impression that we just can simply change our way of thinking. We all, focused thinking, that's handy. All human beings have a range of thinking styles in their head. Would you agree with that or not agree with that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation, doesn't it, as well?
Yeah. In terms of what's going on?
Yeah.
What thoughts we're dipping into?
And also your environment as well.
So, reality check. Our thinking is a mixture of styles. This is the nature of the mind. One of the things that strengthening our observer muscle allows us to do is that we can step back and see which flavour of thoughts we're energising and encouraging. That's what meditation offers us. Does it get rid of our thoughts? No. Does it